Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week we look at Turkey, a country where some democratic freedoms have been declining and media censorship has been growing as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has tightened his grip on power. After 11 years as prime minister, Erdogan became the country's first directly elected president in August. Under Erdogan's tenure, Turkey's economy has grown significantly. The country's main minority group, the Kurds, have gained new rights, and a military with a history of meddling in politics has been kept in its barracks. But press freedom groups like Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists have consistently criticized efforts by Erdogan's AK party to limit freedom of expression and of the press. For example, criticism of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, has been legally prohibited since 2005. Publications in Kurdish have been heavily censored, and during massive anti-government protests in Istanbul's Gezi Park last year, CNN Turk broadcast a documentary about penguins, even as CNN International was covering the demonstrations. In February 2014, Turkey passed a law regulating the country's internet services, allowing the government to shut down or block access to websites with little notice. Criticism of these policies from some Western governments has been muted, in part because of the need for Turkish support in resolving conflicts in Syria and Iraq and between the Ukraine and Russia. On this week's show, we look at the media landscape in Turkey, how it affects both journalists and everyday people, and what it could do to affect Turkey's relations with the West. We are joined from Istanbul, Turkey by Nate Schenken, the Senior Program Associate in Eurasia Programs at Freedom House, from Washington, D.C. by Ambassador Robert Pearson, who was the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 2000 to 2003, and from Boston, Massachusetts by Yavuz Beydar, a Turkish blogger and newspaper columnist who is a fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. I want to welcome all of you to Global Journalist. Ambassador Pearson, could you tell us just briefly what the trajectory of Turkish political life has been since the decade when you were there as U.S. Ambassador?
Jason, thank you very much, and thanks to your audience. Very happy to be part of the program today. The AK Party, as it's known in Turkey, came into power in November of 2002, and it came into power with a fairly liberal program of reform of the economy, a greater control over the military, push for better efforts to achieve membership in the European Union, and more expansive rights for people in the citizenry, and therefore it enjoyed quite a broad spectrum of support. There also was a decade of difficult government for the preceding, I'll call it, traditional parties. And so the AK victory was really built on the record of the inability of previous governments essentially to achieve economic reform. For several years, the government's policies on the economy were able to foster significant economic reform, bringing great wealth to many Turks. And then I would say in about 2007, again, maybe accelerating in 2009 and accelerating at a greater pace in the last couple of years, the government has moved to establish firm control over the institutions in the country, including the press, the judiciary, military, and other institutions, educational process, and other institutions of power in the country.
Nate Schenken, I wanted to follow up with you. What happened in this period, 2007, 2008, 2009, to change the climate for freedom of expression, for human rights, for democracy in Turkey?
That period was one when the AK Party began to face a series of very strong challenges from the secularist establishment and from the military to some extent. There was a constitutional challenge in 2007. There was a referendum to change the Constitution in 2011. Through each of these phases, the AK Party faced threats to its very existence as a party in government, and it responded with ever-increasing crackdowns and an ever-widening scope of pressure on the media and on independent institutions. That process has culminated in the past year and a half, 2 years, as the government has grown unchallenged, as it reached a point where it defeated its opponents, to where the government can now essentially do what it pleases in these areas.
Yavuz Beydar, I wanted to ask you about the 2013 Gezi Park protests that really got a lot of international coverage, and the Turkish government's response to those protests garnered a lot of coverage. Can you tell us what it was like to be a journalist in Turkey then, and how did perceptions of the government within Turkey change as a result of that?
Gezi Park protests was one of the turning points in terms of public perception of what kind of state the Turkish media in general was. Preceding that, first it was the bombing of 34 Kurdish villagers at the end of 2011, which led to a complete media blackout, and that was the very strong signal that told about how much political and proprietor control over the media was. But Gezi was a turning point, a very sharp one, in terms of revealing to the urban public, the elites, upper middle classes of Turkey, that there was something really seriously wrong about the media and the role of journalism that the conglomerate media represented. That was a very difficult period, which was a great test for whether or not journalists in the newsrooms of the main bulks of the media, mainly controlled by big media groups, would be able to disseminate the news that was happening physically next door, in the middle of, at the heart of Istanbul. And they failed. As you mentioned, Penguin documentaries, another channel only 300 yards away from the epicenter of the protests was live 3-4 hours on a program about schizophrenia, which was, I think, depicting the state of Turkish journalism symbolically in that sense. And this was a beginning of the end for many journalists, editors, cameramen, reporters, columnists, to be fired en masse, one after another. And that led to a purge, in a sense, what I see as a purge of the professionals who wanted to defend the dignity and honor of the profession, resistance in terms of that, to be able to continue to conduct journalism as we know it. And the failure continued throughout the summer and continues to this day. More than 900 people, according to the latest reports, were fired, lost their jobs, and they not only lost their jobs, but most of them are being now treated as intoxicated material. They cannot be rehired because the other proprietors are afraid that they will cause problems vis-a-vis the government. So it is a very severe situation. I was one of those who lost the jobs, and what makes it peculiar that I was a news ombudsman, independent, with an independent contract, very strong contract. Despite that fact, I was fired because I was criticizing the content of the newspaper rather harshly, because the reader reactions were very harsh. And this was, 2 of my columns were censored. And as a very peculiar part of history of journalism globally, an independent news ombudsman, even in independent news ombudsman, was fired.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today on Global Journalist, we look at the state of democracy and freedom of expression in Turkey. We're joined from Istanbul, Turkey by Nate Schenken, a researcher in the Eurasia Programs Group at Freedom House, from Washington, D.C. by Ambassador Robert Pearson, the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 2000 to 2003, and from Boston, Massachusetts by Yavuz Baydar, a Turkish blogger and newspaper columnist studying at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Ambassador Pearson, I wanted to ask you, in late May, early June, in Syria, the Turkish consulate was attacked by the Islamic State, and there were 49 hostages, Turkish hostages, taken by the militant group. Almost immediately afterwards, there was a media blackout in Turkey of coverage of this event. Could you tell us a little bit about this phenomenon and why it took place?
Well, to be honest, I can't explain why it took place. I could speculate that the government thought that controlling all of the media conversations in Turkey about the efforts they would have to undertake to get their diplomatic personnel, families, and others back could be better conducted without any publicity in the Turkish press. That's an unusual position to take. And the government then, at the end of a long process of silence, announced a victory and did not disclose what the terms were. This is an example that of an announced success that actually increases speculation and concern about what actually did happen and why. So in the long run, it's probably counterproductive. In the short run, the government was able to achieve its goal of negotiating the release of these captives without having the press speculate about it. And as I said, I can't really explain why they thought that was a better step to take than allowing people to discuss this issue in the press and in the public as the government tried to get their captives returned.
And Nate Schenken in Istanbul, these types of gag orders are not completely unheard of in Turkey. Can you tell us a little bit more about other efforts by the Turkish government to silence discussion of some issues?
Sure. We saw another good example of these blackouts was in May 2013, after there was a very large bombing in a border town, a Turkish border town, Reyhanli, along the border with Syria. Again, the government sought to impose a blackout on all news coverage of that event. More broadly speaking, there are a whole host of topics that have been made taboo or off limits for the Turkish press. And chief among those would be corruption and the relationship between the government and certain businesses, large construction firms, other kinds of conglomerates, many of which own, in fact, the media outlets. So it's a vicious circle in which the government seeks to suppress information about certain things, and it uses the levers that it's accumulated through its consolidation of power to keep those things out of the papers that its allies in business own.
Yavuz Baydar, for a number of years, the Committee to Protect Journalists had listed Turkey as the top jailer of journalists in the world. Now, recently, they've released a number of journalists from prison, and yet we still hear reports that there's a media crackdown going on. Can you explain how Turkey can both be releasing journalists from jail and cracking down on the media at the same time?
The number of jail journalists peaked approximately 2 years ago, up to 90 plus. According to the latest report issued by BIA Monitoring as a source, it's an independent source that cooperates with Reporters Sans Frontières, and that is indicating a number of jail journalists as 2022 as of now. So that number is on the decrease. The decrease depends on certainly about what the government aims to do with the peace process negotiations with the PKK, because most of the jail journalists were Kurds, up to 85%. While the jail journalists the number is decreasing, as I indicated, the punitive measure to silence journalism shifted away from that towards firings and sackings. That is a much more cunning method that is being more and more implemented in Balkans and also in the Middle East, but Turkey on the top as most visible example. The new crackdown, as if you mean by new crackdown a new draft bill that is presented to the General Assembly of Turkish Parliament, that is something which raises the concerns about further control, as some indicate, more towards a police state. That is particularly highlighted in a clause in the draft bill that gives the authorities powers to seize the assets of even the media outlets seen as aiding and abetting the terror organizations. And at the center focal point of that is the Erdogan's personal vendetta against Gülen movement, which has 2 or 3 rather influential.
Sorry, the Gulen
media
movement
points.
is the opposition movement centered around the exiled Turkish cleric in Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a mildly sort of liberal Islamic sect that is being accused of being a sort of a shadow state, parallel state by Erdogan. And those assets are in the firing line. And also the independent newspaper Taraf, which has been visited more and more often by the tax inspectors lately. This means it will be open to interpretations of misinterpretations by the prosecutors and the police if they see any quote-unquote reasonable doubt that there is an aiding and abetting going on, say a columnist criticizing the government, Erdogan, etc., fiercely, could be seen or interpreted as aiding and abetting terror organizations. So that is a very worrisome, uncharted water that this bill takes Turkey into, which is, I think, which could be the cause of a new wave of measures that will continue to suffocate Turkish media.
Ambassador Pearson, the United States, the European Union are close allies with Turkey. Can you describe how forceful they have been in talking to the Turkish government about some of these restrictions and what some of the other constraints they have with Turkey in terms of their relationship with them?
To take you back just a little bit, the implication in the question, as you originally framed it, is that both Turks and Americans feel that Turkey's importance to the larger conflict in the Middle East is worth paying the price of domestic tranquility in Turkey. And I don't think that American policymakers are following that line. They're not being silent about Turkey in order to encourage Turkey to cooperate in other areas. Those two are separate issues. And I think that you will have seen statements by the State Department and others that have been quite clear about the U.S. view towards press freedom and the U.S. view towards things that Turkey has said that don't agree with approaches that the U.S. government has taken. So I think that for me, the important point is that these are both important issues. Democracy is an important value for the U.S. And if I could just give you a good synopsis, it would be that ordinarily countries that want to control the press do so in order to lead with a good story that can't be attacked later. And that process actually results in leaks and innuendos and speculation and that ultimately degrade the good news that's been announced. In an open society, every government knows that the moment they announce an initiative, somebody's going to test it in public. And so in an open society, as the initiative goes forward, it actually becomes better, it's better informed. It's not just a matter of having people know what's going on. It's a matter of having people debate and add to the quality of the discussion about what's going on. And in the end, if you started with a good idea, you actually end up with a better idea. So that is the reason why Turkey is compelled, it appears, at points to just keep on trying to exercise greater and greater control. And a much better process would be to allow this public debate. The government would have ultimately greater support for the choices it makes, and the Turkish people would have greater confidence in the choices the government is taking.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today on Global Journalist, we look at the state of democracy and freedom of expression in Turkey. We are joined from Istanbul, Turkey by Nate Schenken, a researcher in the Eurasia programs at Freedom House, from Washington, D.C., by Ambassador Robert Pearson, who was the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 2000 to 2003, and from Boston, Massachusetts, by Yavuz Beydar, a Turkish blogger and newspaper columnist, now studying at Harvard's Kennedy School. For more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive and read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Nate Schenken in Istanbul, I wanted to ask you, how does the Turkish public, how do they circumvent some of these restrictions on the media and on social media? How do they share information? How effective are they in getting news events out that are declared taboo by the government?
Turks are pretty imaginative, They're pretty innovative. You see a lot of things that have grown up, especially since the Gezi Park protests in May, June 2013. There's been an explosion in internet news sites and in citizen journalism sites. And we're seeing things being tested or being developed in Turkey in terms of citizen journalism networks, ways of sharing information that we're not seeing anywhere else around the world. So in that sense, it's a very exciting and groundbreaking place for new journalism. But the reason for it, of course, is that people have been driven out of the traditional media, like Yavuz has described. You have a lot of talent that is looking for a way to share the news. And so they're out there on the internet. They're trying to get events out. The unfortunate truth, though, about media online is that it doesn't reach the same audience that the TV does or that print newspapers still do in Turkey, especially as you move up the generation cohorts. So while among young people, it's about 70% of people are getting news online, once you move up over 30 years old, over 40 years old, especially over 50 or 60, that number is going to drop down to 40, 20, 10%. And so the reach of the online news is not the same as the cable news still has in Turkey.
Yavuz Baydar, there's been a lot of discussion about the role of religion, about the role of Islam in Turkish politics. How do you see that Turkish society has changed in recent years, and how does that affect the media?
There are changes that have taken place, but there are also some of the things remain the same. The stage, if you look at the social and political theater of Turkey, there has been an ongoing intolerance from whichever vantage point you look at, except perhaps the Kurdish political movement that has some form of pro-freedom agenda in parliament. But the rest of the political actors, AK Party, CHP or MHP, all three main parties represented in parliament, do not really have a pro-freedom agenda based on tolerance for dissent, etc., diversity, etc. That is something that's worrisome. That's point number one. So this reflects upon also in general the culture on the society as a whole, that reflects upon in terms of fierce demonization, ongoing hatred for each other, various social segments of the society, but also remaining anti-Semitism, also remaining anti-Americanism, anti-West sentiments, etc., etc. But overall, I would say, if you look at the opinion polls in terms of Islamization, what many see as Islamization, what I see is still as more conservative shift of the society rather than sheer Islamization. You could see that in opinion polls, for example, those who sympathize with movements like ISIS or Al-Nusra or Brotherhood, etc., are all around 10 to 12, 15%, maybe at the most. So the way, though, the main bulks of the pious segments, what they brought into the stage more and more is, apart from general intolerance for various like atheists or seculars, etc., they brought in a new culture, new climate where the blasphemy or any form of even mildest forms of critical views vis-a-vis Islam is now being viewed as something to be punishable.
Ambassador Pearson, if I could turn to you, our time is growing short in the show. Could you describe for us, just briefly, there's been a lot of news coverage of events in Syria and Iraq recently with fighting taking place right at the Turkish border. Can you describe for us how Turkey's interests diverge or are similar to the U.S. and the West when it comes to the fight against ISIS in Syria?
Yes, I can. Let me just add one preliminary comment, and that is that President Erdogan grew up in a culture that was outside what we would call the establishment in Turkey. And so he grew up and matured politically with a position that was not accepted by the traditional parties or the traditional secular state of Turkey. And he feels that in order to manage issues in Turkey, that he must control those institutions. And I think that the audience needs to know that's probably his state of mind as he proceeds. And he sees democracy as residing solely in the ballot box. Even members of his own party don't agree with that position, but that's one of the reasons why he
You mean solely in the ballot box as opposed to civil society and freedom of expression and these other...
Having other institutions, the judiciary, the press, and an informed public play a role in making decisions and in supporting the choices that the country makes. Now, as to the conflict with ISIS, there is a clear difference of opinion between Turkey and the United States. From the very beginning, the AK party and the government has had as their priority the overthrow of Bashar Assad in Syria. And their argument to the United States is that anything that destroys ISIS also destroys one potential force that is at war with the Assad regime. They are also concerned about the agenda of the Kurds in Syria and in northern Iraq, and they are concerned that this will affect the attitudes of Kurdish citizens of Turkey and make their plans to achieve an overall peace agreement with the Kurds more difficult. The United States has a policy of taking a role of leadership, but having the countries in the region take the lead on supplying troops and other personnel and becoming effective in fighting ISIS on the ground. There is no American sentiment in the public for putting American troops back into that region, and I think that's difficult for the government in Accra to fully embrace, but I'm sure their embassy in Washington is telling them this because this is a constant theme in American dialogue. So at the moment, there is a clear dichotomy between what Turkey wants and what the U.S. wants, but the events on the ground are slowly forcing the two countries to take more parallel positions. The Turks now have agreed that Kurds from northern Iraq may travel through Turkey into the area where Kurds in Syria are fighting the ISIS fighters. And the United States has begun to supply the Kurdish fighters in Syria with effective weapons to counter the attempt to take the city of Kobani. So slowly, I won't say surely, slowly, these two countries are finding ways in which small steps are beginning to bring them closer together. But the big question is whether Turkey will insist on having the overthrow of the Assad regime as its first priority, or whether countering ISIS will become its immediate first priority. And there, the two countries are still far apart.
That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our thanks to Nate Schenken, Ambassador Robert Pearson, and Yavuz Baydar for joining us. Our executive producer is Casey Morrell. Our lead producer this week is Siddharth Vodnala, with assistance from Bia Ciordia, Tracy Goldner, Matt Zuzolo, and Jack Howard. Travis McMillan from RJI is our technical director, and Pat Akers of KBIA is our audio engineer. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.